like people are pretty settled. We have started our recording. This is our May 13th event. Um, I see some familiar faces and some new faces in our Zoom audience. Welcome, welcome. Each month, BRJA hosts a 13th of the month event. This one is the discussion for the good of the children, racism, race hate, and the myth of reunification, Dianne Lyday's book. As many of you know from the invitation that you saw from the flyer, and if you're a new face, it's probably a special invitation that you were given because you either knew Diane or were very familiar with the topic. So we're excited to have you here with us today. Dana, you can go to the next slide. So go ahead and you can grab your snack now. Something that I do often is I will be in a meeting and I'm all excited about the topic, and then I forget that I left my charger somewhere and I have to run to the room before my laptop goes off. So go ahead and grab your charger right now. Keep that close by and plugged up if you need to. We will be doing a little bit of journaling. So now is also the time for you to grab paper and pen, write your questions down or important things that people said throughout the event. And then we'll ask you to try to be as present as you can be. We know the time of the day. Again, we know that it's dinner time. Some of you have kids, pets that want your attention. But as much as you can, try to block out the distractions, try to stop your phone, and try to be as present as you can be. And this is a reminder for those of you that have been to multiple 13th events and an announcement for new people that BRJA is on the social medias. So we are Be More Anti-Racist on Facebook and on Twitter, on Instagram as well. And then for YouTube, you can find us at Baltimore Racial Justice Action. We record our 13th of the month events. So you can find previous months on here. The event from tonight will probably be posted in about 3 or 4 days after the event. And there are other special videos that we have posted on YouTube that we've called our short takes, and some more of those that will be happening in the future. So please subscribe to the YouTube, follow us on Facebook, like us on the Instagram, retweet us on Twitter. We're all the places. And here's some stuff about BRJA. So we have been around since 2003. Um, Diane, who we are talking about today, is one of the founders of Baltimore Racial Justice Action and has been part of the group since 2003. We are a program of Fusion Partnership. Um, BRJA started off as a network of individuals and has grown into what you all are seeing and experiencing today. On the public side of this, our 13th of the month events, our public workshops that we have for peoples of color, white people. And then on the contractual side, we do work where we privately contract with institutions to do work to from assessments to foundational trainings to coaching around racial equity within their institution and with the institutions that they interact with. And I skipped ahead to that slide, so we can go to the next one. Our last announcement is about donating and becoming a monthly sustainer. So our 13th of the month events are free. In order for us to continue to make those free, the contributions that you give us allow these to keep happening, allow us to be able to coordinate and have great panelists like we're going to have today, allow us to have the time to strategize and plan around these. So we greatly appreciate contributions not only to this, but all of the work that BRJA is doing. You can do a one-time donation at bemoreantiracist.com/donate, or you can become a monthly sustainer. Monthly sustainer could be for, I think, as low as $1 all the way to $1,000 or beyond, whatever you're feeling that you need a release from your pocketbook. We're happy for it. So again, that's bemoreantiracist.com/donate. And I will pass it over to Julia now.
Hello, everyone. Once again, thank you, Anthony, for doing that lovely introduction. And I want to welcome everybody to BRJA's May 2021's 13th of the month event. This is our events on a discussion for the good of the children, racism, red tape, and the myth of reunification. So we have a really nice kind of, not jam-packed, but a really intense, I think, kind of event talking about a really, really important topic. And we want to make sure that you guys are, of course, ready and prepared. So just before we get started, I just want to let you know that because of the subject matter, we want to make sure that you guys are taking care of yourself, that you are, like really checking into your own emotions. So if you need to take a step back, please make sure you are doing that. You can go to the next slide, Dana. So this is our kind of a quick agenda. We already discussed our welcome. Next up, we're going to have Adar, who's going to do kind of a background and a grounding of this event. And then we're going to have some readings from the actual book from some of our BRJA members. And then we're going to have a panel discussion. So those, that will be kind of like the bulk of the event. We do want to talk about what more people can do to support child welfare and these topics. And then we're going to open it up for audience questions, and then we'll close. So next up is going to be, I believe, Adar. You can go to the next slide. And Adar, you are up.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, everyone. And we're so glad that you're here today. I must say that I feel the weight of this moment because I'm offering these words as a representative of the BRJA staff, Anthony, Dana, and Rebecca, and myself, who work beside Dianne every day. And also as a representative of BRJA's advisory board, again, including Anthony and Erica, Christina, Harriet, Julia, Michelle, and Dottie, whose friendship with Dianne, along with my own, predated BRJA. And also, I offer these words as a representative of all BRAJ colleagues who worked with and were in learning community with, and for all of us who loved Dianne Lyday. In BRJA, we just loved working with Dianne. We loved her acerbic sense of humor. We loved the ways in which she would steer you with a question and a smile to what she really wanted to talk about, and while insisting and positioning it is your idea. We loved how generous she was as a co-facilitator. Generous and insightful and honest and authentic. Dianne was real and she was straight, no chaser. If she felt it, you knew it. And as a facilitator, especially in dealing with white people, Dianne was not one to tolerate the BS. See, Dianne was that rare white woman who actually did the internal work to earn her seat at the table as a colleague, as a friend, and also as the person that you would want in the trenches of this work beside you. There wasn't a performative bone in Dianne's body. And unlike people who, in the age of social media, who are these keyboard warriors or who confuse the work with being up to date on the lingo and terminology or amassing likes and followers, the majority of Dianne's work was behind the scenes. In BRJA, Dianne was our historian. She was our administrative person. She was the master of creating exercises that highlighted teachable moments. She was our fill the gap servant leader. She was all of that to us, yet never once would she even have conceived that her death would have left this ocean-sized hole in our organization or in our hearts. She wouldn't conceive that. She was too modest, not looking for or accepting the spotlight. So she never saw that she owned that spotlight. And if she had heard us saying this, she would without a doubt make some snide remark, completely discounting everything that I've just said about her role in our work and in our lives. In WARN, BRJA's white anti-racist network, Dianne was that rock steady white person who because she made it a daily practice to self-interrogate to make sure that she was actually living anti-racism principles, she was the mirror for other white people. Dianne was a white woman with Black children, and she never, ever, ever, not once in all the years that I knew her, used them as a shield to mitigate her own racial privilege. She never used them to say, look at me, see, I'm not like other white people because I have Black children. She never ever used them as her racial equity passport. But her journey as a white woman with Black children drove her understanding of both her own privilege and her commitment to this work, even when that caused awkwardness and estrangement with her family and with some of her white friends. As I said, Dianne was the real deal, who was in this work with everything that she was. In BRJA, we have a saying that everything is text. And Dianne offered up her journey always as text for learning for both white people and people of color. That journey made her, as I've said, very impatient with the BS, but it also deepened her empathy to ask challenging questions in empathetic ways and to listen with empathy and with understanding. She knew, she had been there. Because she felt this work so very deeply, she was generosity defined in how she gave time and space as a mentor to others who were on this journey, whether it was by phone or by Zoom or by meeting for coffee and breakfast pre-pandemic. And all who knew Dianne knew how much she loved her breakfast meetings. Her commitment to racial inclusion and racial equity and racial justice even showed up in her art, in her poetry, in her quilting, in her beadwork, and also in the book that we are here this evening to discuss. This book is about how white supremacy in the social service system deliberately broke up her family. Again, she used her family's journey as text to show how systemic racism is allowed to run rampant legally in Black communities through Black families. She wrote this masterpiece with vulnerability, with clarity, with truth, with searing honesty. In other words, Dianne Lyday once again used her journey in yet another art form to speak truth to community and to power. We miss Dianne. Every day, we miss Dianne. But we also know that the light that she was shines in us. The BRJA and each of us with whom she had relationship are part of her legacy. And in knowing that, we continue to move forward in the light and in the fight for racial justice. Dianne isn't gone. She lives. She lives in her family. She lives in her work. She lives in her, which is why we're so grateful this evening to present a discussion of For the Good of the Children, Racism, Red Tape, and the Myth of Reunification. This is an in-depth discussion of Dianne's masterpiece, her book. And with that, I would like to welcome our panelist, Janine Godsey, who is a Baltimore native. Janine has experience organizing to confront issues that perpetuate degradation of humanity to humanity and inequality around race, environment, education, and the health of families and community. Janine approaches the work in a way that aims to move towards sovereignty. And she believes that in order to achieve this, each of us must be consciously dedicated to examining the internal structures and policies we are governed by that perpetuate resource apartheid. Her commitment to addressing the socially engineered traumas of anti-Blackness is part of her foundation as a public servant. Welcome, Janine. I'd also like to welcome William Ishaya, who is Clinical Associate Professor and Executive Director of the Social Work Community Outreach Service, also known as SWACOS, at the University of Maryland School of Social Work. Wendy is also the founder of the Positive School Center. Her work focuses on creating positive school climate and reducing the disproportionate suspensions and expulsions of children of color and children with disabilities from Maryland schools. Wendy also developed what is known as the SHARP framework for providing services to people who have experienced poverty and depression. Wendy, we're so glad that you're here. Welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
And last but not least, Stephanie S. Franklin Esquire, who is the president and CEO of the Franklin Law Group, PC, a family justice center protecting the human rights of children and families in the child welfare and legal policy spaces for over 14 years. Stephanie's commitment to and life work for equity, justice, and recognition has been focused primarily on Black people who are descendants of captive and enslaved Africans in the United States. Stephanie conducts race equity training nationally and is published on issues of racial justice and human rights in the child welfare space. Her life's work is fueling the establishment of a child welfare training center, an extension of her law firm's practices that will be launched this December 2021. Stephanie, welcome. Again, we thank you all for coming. We welcome you in this space. And with that, I turn it over to you, Julia.
Hello again, everyone. First of all, thank you, Adar, for your wonderful, beautiful words about Dianne. We certainly miss her with the RJA, and she was just a force and someone who truly, truly, I think, just like her humor and everything is just beautiful. So thank you for those words. And also thank you to our panel members for being here with us to discuss this really important topic. How this is actually going to go, we are going to do some actual readings from Dianne's book. We recommend everyone actually go and support by buying the book. Usually probably online, you can look at Red Emma's or like bookshop.org, something like that. And we really want you all to listen to some of the text in the book, because I think this will kind of contextualize the actual conversation. So we have some wonderful readers who are going to read some excerpts from the story. And so actually, Dana, can you put up the PowerPoint just to kind of show people who is going to be reading for us today? Thank you. So we have 3 excerpts that are going to be read by 3 wonderful people. We have Molly, who's going to be our first reader. She's going to be reading how the DSS handles things for the good of the children. Dianne will be reading what's necessary for reunification and anger and aggression, racialized assumptions. And then we're going to have Rajani, who's going to end us with white reality and colonization. After each reading.
All right, Pam.
Sorry, after each reading, we are going to have the panel actually discuss what was in each excerpt and kind of like get a feeling for what they think and their thoughts. And then later on, like, as I said, we will open it up to the audience. Just a reminder, as I mentioned before, some of the things that are mentioned in this story is pretty heavy. And we want to make sure that everyone is taking care of themselves. So please make sure that you are checking in with yourself during this time and that you are, if you need to step away, making sure you step away. And yes, thank you. So we're going to start with Molly.
Thanks, Julia.
No problem.
Background. 3 of the children, except for the youngest, have been placed in Dianne's custody, but are still under DSS guardianship. After a period of acting out their anger and pain in many ways, the 2 boys have settled back into beginning to feel the love they used to know before foster care. The boys are playing a video game. Jaina is still at school. Jacob is cooking, and Dianne is reading a novel. Dianne. Someone knocked on the door, and I put my book down. I glanced out the window, and there were 2 women on the porch. I opened the door, and before they could say anything, I saw 4 police cars pulled up. The officers, looking like a SWAT team, had vacated their cruisers and were walking across my lawn toward the front porch. I looked at the women. the new social worker, and her supervisor, and one said, "May we come in?" Confused, I stepped back to let them pass. A few of the officers entered with them, dressed in bulletproof vests, guns, and batons at their side. Jacob came out of the kitchen and asked what's going on. I said I didn't know and looked around at the people in my living room. The social worker's supervisor said, "We're taking the boys because we got a report that they were unsupervised," and handed me some papers. I turned away from them and sat down. Jacob indicated he wasn't going to help them. The police called upstairs to the boys, who by now had stopped playing their video game and were listening from their bedroom. They reluctantly came downstairs, and a police officer told them they had to go with the social workers. The boys simultaneously said, "We don't want to go." They looked at their father. He shrugged, indicating it wasn't up to him, and said, "They have guns." The police herded the boys out the front door. They told them to get in the social worker's car, and the youngest boy did. But while they walked the older boy to the other side, the younger one jumped out. The older one yanked himself away from the police officer's hand on his shoulder and joined his brother, screaming, "We want to stay with our dad." As the police officers approached the boys, the social workers stood in the street and watched, expressionless. The boys saw the police approaching and simultaneously broke and ran around the house, through the backyard, out the fence, and into the woods. The police followed through the thickets and dead branches, much to their obvious annoyance. Jacob and I watched and saw the police coming through the backwoods with the boys in tow. The boys, 9 and 11, were handcuffed behind their backs. The police forced them into the cruiser to sit on the handcuffs and closed the doors. The younger one leaned over toward the middle of the seat and began kicking at the car window until it came loose. Through the broken window, he cried, "Dad, help us! Don't let them take us!" More police were called. Something in me snapped, and I began screaming at the social workers about reunification. What kind of people are you? A 6'4" police officer walked up to me and put his face within an inch of my face and threatened to arrest me for disturbing the peace. I suddenly felt weak and helpless and stood there until he walked away. I walked back to the porch while the officers talked among themselves and the social workers. Then one by one, they drove off with our boys, leaving us to wonder what the hell just happened. Jacob was crying. This is all they told us. They got a report. They would not tell us from whom, what it said, when this unsupervision supposedly occurred, nothing. Jana was at school. They picked her up there without telling us they had done so. Jacob's court-ordered psychiatric evaluation was scheduled for that day. He missed it.
Thank you, Molly, for reading. So that is, of course, a very intense story and a very scary one. So I wanted to ask the panel, what are your first impressions of this snippet?
I guess I had a thought when I read this about this idea that if you pair social workers with police, that everything will work out just beautifully. And the question I kept asking was, what was the role of the social workers there? Why were they even there? What were they supposed to do? We know that in social work practice is deeply embedded in white supremacy. And so the idea that just having a social worker there with the police will create less trauma for children, will make this work smoother and easily is just not rooted in reality. The truth is that the social workers were as much a part of this violence that was enacted against this family as the police were. And what we do know from our profession is that because our profession is so deeply rooted in white supremacy, that pairing police and social workers together just creates um, uh, a double process with two different agencies that just reinforce the anti-Blackness that we see in child welfare. So that was the first thought I had. So I'll be quiet and let the others speak.
Yeah, I I had a similar thought as well. But another thing that came to mind for me was I can't imagine what it must have been like for our ancestors who had to watch their children be sold off, right? Like the
Mhm.
sense of powerlessness, to watch your family stripped from you, ripped from you. And the only thing that's standing between you all and death is your silence, right? Like, and what, when we think about how aggressive the officer got with Diane. Um, so that's something that also came up for me, like who, like it mirrors that. And then also, how do we define family, right? Who gets to define it for us? Because there was a time where people of color, well, Black people, were not allowed to marry each other, right? They weren't allowed to have ownership over their own families. And so it almost felt like that was playing out in this situation.
So there was a lot that came up for me here. So first of all, I had an intense emotional response to reading it. That's number one. And in the interest of time and not to talk so much because I can really delve into this topic because it's my favorite topic to talk about. What came to me was thinking about those children, not only Jacob, not only Miss Diane, but the children. I thought about them 9 and 11 years old being handcuffed, screaming, I want to be with my dad. So all I could think about was trauma. And in connection with what Janine spoke about, right? I think about the ancestral memories that run in our bones, that run through our bloodlines, that we are so very much aware of, but are dismissed as if we're crazy, right? So for me, it is this constant frame and context that I even see in practice about the dehumanization of Black bodies, period, right? And that people often say to me, Stephanie, you always go back to a historic frame. That happened so many years ago, but it's rooted there. And the dehumanization continues to this day that nobody wants to address. The extreme subjugation of Black people in this country. And let me be real clear about something. My work is centered around those of us who are Black people who are descendants of captive and enslaved Africans in the US. And I want to be very specific about that because the Black experience, whether you were those of us who are what I call decals, that's my lineage, I'm decals, are the ancestors who built this country physically, blood and bone in the ground off their back. And that every experience of other Black people who have come later, because Blackness is not flat, we have different ethnicities within the Black African-American racial category can experience that same type of degradation based on what Blackness has been defined since the inception, since some of us who are descendants of captive and enslaved Africans were brought here. And I do want to say this because I need to make this distinction because we don't talk about this enough. There are some Black people who are indigenous to this land, who are Native American people that people don't recognize. But I wanted to say that because that's the first thing that popped into my head, dehumanization.
Absolutely. It's interesting that you have brought up, of course, that relationship, Wendy, between the police and social workers, considering that as of late, there's been a huge conversation about defunding the police. And one of the first things that people said was, well, we can just have like social workers, like do this work. And it's like, of course, like I think that the training and the kind of ideologies that we learn, with, social work, it would make sense that it would fit. But as you all have pointed out, that without talking about the historical kind of grounding and analysis there, these are all things that are embedded. Like white supremacy is embedded in all of our systems, no matter how much we believe that they're about caring and loving people. And so it's really, really important that we understand that. And so I guess like my question would be, how do we evaluate, like how do you evaluate that kind of like that white supremacy with this kind of new idea of like what we can do to get rid of it? Like how can we approach the welfare of children and family reunification, or just like social work in general, about working with families in a way that is going to not dehumanize people, that is not going to subjugate people to kind of racist, overtly racist ideals.
One thing, and I know we're really focusing on race. I wonder if we'll get to that point simply because of the capitalism aspect that's kind of interwoven into it as well. Um, People remain employed when the living conditions of people are kind of the way that they are. And even though we know people are often overworked and underpaid, you still have a job, which is why I think sometimes people don't want to see the abolition of um, prisons, because people would lose their jobs. So I think the same thing is kind of applicable here, um, that it is a profitable thing. And I do think that it's important to have the historical context when we think about like the institution of chattel enslavement, how I guess it went away. It just really shifted, right? There really wasn't a need to like pick cotton per se, right? But you could still commodify the existence of people. And Black folks or people from the African diaspora were the best entity identified to be able to be commodified. And we just shifted that commodification in different institutions and structures. So I don't really think that answered, but that was something that came to mind when you asked your question.
Well,
No, I think that's definitely something. Go ahead, Wendy, I'm
I
sorry.
just want to piggyback on what Janine was saying is also because child welfare is a capitalist system. When we think about this, a lot of children enter into the child welfare system purely because of poverty, right? The families may not have everything they need, and children need to eat every day. We get that. Lights have to stay on. Kids can't be on the street. That's all true. But if we think about, we know that in most cases in child welfare, children aren't, it's more neglect than children being severely abused, right? So a lot of that neglect is grounded in poverty and parents being, overwhelmed and trying to survive. It's very hard to try to survive. And at the same time, you're a different parent when you're struggling for survival, right? But what if we took that same money that we use to remove children from their homes and put them in another home? What if we use that money to support the families who are experiencing the poverty? Now, there'll be fewer social workers in child welfare. This is true, right? But that is not even a part of our system, right? We have one of the criticisms of the child welfare system is that we have this whole extensive, expensive system that's in place to address the symptoms of poverty, when we could use that money to address the root causes of poverty and get children out of child welfare. But it is not in our best interest to do that. And as a society, we have to reckon with that.
And I want to speak to it from the legal perspective. I know, Julia, you asked about it from the social work perspective. I'm going to talk to it from the legal perspective, and I'm going to generalize here because I think that the legal system is completely ill-equipped to work with Black families. And specifically, I'm talking DCAL's families. They are completely ill-equipped to deal with them. And that includes those who are Black, that are judges, that are magistrates, that are attorneys. It's not just the social work field, right? And so some of it, what you see is that there is an undereducation and a miseducation and an unwillingness to learn about how to deal with Black families, in particular decals specifically. And the reason why I say decals is that most of the children in the child welfare system in this country are those of us who are descendants of captive and enslaved Africans in the US, right? We know in other parts like New York, there are Black people that, are from the continent, of Africa or from other diasporan places. We understand that, but the majority of children in the child welfare system, because we are the largest numbers here, right, are DCAL's peoples. And so you have a bench, you have court stakeholders that are completely ill-equipped to deal with Black families. And there is this notion, whether it is conscious or not, that we are culturally deficient and that we need to have a level of oversight because we just don't know how to raise children, despite the fact that Black women who were DCALs are ones who reared white children. Okay, so we don't like to talk about that. And then we have Black folks who are in these positions of power, who are decision makers, who are injured themselves and afraid to make those pioneering, more what people may call radical efforts and call it out because they're afraid for their jobs, they're afraid because of the stigmatization or ostracization, so they won't do it. I can't tell you that all of these Black people who do this work, there are so few that speak specifically to this issue about race. They won't do it. Part of it is fear because of the lash, right? The lashback. But part of it is also that some of them don't know. They kind of fall into the system and don't do their own type of reading or understanding or analysis on the depths of this problem. And I'm calling out Black lawyers because they oftentimes don't say a word. Okay, they don't say anything. So, it is clearly with white folks, and these are other quote unquote, I have to tell you, I don't use the word people of color. I find it to be a term that erases people's specific experiences, their specific identities, their specific histories, their specific ties to this land, and also their specific injuries. And so, and all of that, I say this, and I'm going to close because I know you need to move on, is that one of the things that I have really been pushing has been this federal Child Family Welfare Act that deals with descendants of captive and enslaved Africans in the US. So when we think about ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act, the Native Americans have been very good at saying that their children have a unique history, they have a unique harm, and it needs to be addressed, right? And there's some other things too, because they're independent nations and all of those things. But I have been pushing that who else is more unique than DCAL's children with their experience? So while Native American children being put in boarding schools, our kids were picking cotton in the fields at 2 years old, okay? Or when they went to the antebellum North, right? When they were fugitive enslaved children, they were placed in orphanages and then as young as 8, put in and working as indentured servants. I mean, I want people to think about that. And you don't think that injury endures in the bloodlines today? But people don't know that because they're undereducated, they're miseducated, and they don't want to know. So if you want to know, you have to dig for it. And people are not willing to do that because we are what? A culturally deficient people. So they say.
Well now. I don't really know what else there is to say. I did want to hit on some really interesting points that you have brought up, Stephanie, mainly that kind of question of who gets to define family, and then particularly who gets to define what a child is, what childhood looks like. Because as we've seen in this country, right, we already know that our young Black boys and young Black girls are not seen as children. They're seen as adults. They're seen as, these kind of superhuman entities that apparently, just like come out of the ground and just like, I don't know, fly in the air, I don't know, or superhuman strength. So I think that also it's like this kind of regulation of these superhuman children that, it's like we're doing it for their own good, we're doing it for the good of society and make sure they're protected. But all of that is rooted in how we view Black people. It's this anti-Blackness at work. And so that question of who gets to define family and who gets to define what childhood is so important, whether you're a lawyer or a social worker or a police officer, that you can't tell the difference. That's a problem. And also your thought about Black people and Black women, particularly rearing white children. I cannot remember the exact discussion, but it was a Toni Morrison talk where she talks about the fact that, we're always taught that white people saw, enslaved people as less than human. But it's like, you don't let people you don't see as human raise your children. You know what I mean? You don't let people who you see as property cook your food. So there's also a disconnect in the lies that we're telling in these stories in our own histories about what is actually happening. And that's something that needs to be, I think, discussed. Not necessarily right now because we'll be talking all day, but just that something that I think that, as an audience, people should think about when we're having these discussions. I think we might be ready for the second reading. And so our second reading is going to be done by Dianne. Okay, I think we're about to move from that. And Dianne, you are up.
Okay. Background. During nearly 2 years of the children in foster care, Jacob has obeyed all the rules, clean drug test, keeping court appointments and evaluation visits, attending parent classes, where according to Dianne's conversation with a friend, after his first class, the instructor asked Jacob to do a presentation at his next class, not about what Jacob learned in the class, but what the instructor learned from him. Most especially, visits with the children were top priorities. Bonita had missed court appointments, failed to appear for a court-appointed mental health evaluation, and missed dozens of visits with the children, even moved out of the state, making visits impossible. At the court date for determining reunification of the children with Jacob, this is what happened. When the social worker testified that the children should remain in foster care, the reason she cited was because Mr. McKnight continues to say inappropriate things about the department. The judge broke her off and said that the mother has serious mental health problems and is out of state. You're going to have to look at this guy. Say again? What this meant was that for the past year and a half, DSS had not looked at this guy. It has become increasingly clear that in spite of the bureaucratic rhetoric about the permanency plan begins reunification with one of the parents, DSS had no intention of even considering Jacob. Everything they had asked him to do was apparently busy work, while they reestablished Bonita's parenting credentials. The children were not returned. DSS regularly assigned anger and aggression to Jacob when there was none. After a decade of doing anti-racist training, I have learned that this is a common response from white people when Black people say things that white people don't want to hear, or even if they simply speak directly. In other words, it is Black people's responsibility to protect white people's feelings. DSS wouldn't have had to assign anger to me. I was admittedly angry and told the psychologist so. He even asked me how angry was I, but he didn't find any underlying disorders in my anger, as he did in evaluating Jacob. To try to pathologize Jacob's attempts to speak honestly and to ask that as criteria for taking and keeping his children was unfair, unprofessional, inaccurate, and in this case, racist. They folded instances of my actual anger into instances where they had assigned anger to Jacob and used that to define Jacob as not just angry, but angry and aggressive. Not once did Jacob display any aggression. Jacob cooperated with every single court-ordered mandate, every ridiculous visitation schedule, every stingy telephone schedule, every meeting, no matter how disruptive of his schedule or plans. To argue that he wasn't cooperative is preposterous. He simply wasn't pliant, and that must have infuriated them, because 18 months into it, it had been obvious that it was personal.
Thank you so much, Dianne, for reading that excerpt. I'm going to give Dana a second to get our panel back, spotlighted back on our screens. But one of the first questions that I did want to ask, obviously, this kind of almost goes really directly into what we were just speaking about, how we were talking about, childhood, who gets to be a child, what does that look like, particularly for Black children. So, like, what are you all's impressions of this excerpt and how does it make you feel?
Go ahead, Ms. Stephanie. Go ahead. There were, well, I think, at one point, Black children were considered super predators. And then we kind of just did away with that terminology. But, it doesn't matter if you do away with the terminology, it's really about how you treat me. And so I think that oftentimes Black children are seen as pathological. They're vilified in some weird way, or viewed as these objects, right? That's what stood out to me, is like just how pathological the children were viewed. But the other thing that really stood out was about how there were no underlying disorders in Miss Dianne's anger, right? The DSM is the Bible for social workers, right? It is is what we're guided by, is how we're supposed to operate. And it actually supersedes whatever good pedagogy or teaching we had from a professor in the social work school that we went to. So like, if this is what is guiding the way people, how they respond to people, then you have to address the issue that is happening with the teaching for social workers. Like, and we'll probably talk about that a little bit later, but that's what also stood out, was that there was this text that guided how, like, this person was able to, like, judge or criticize Jacob, but didn't do the same for Miss Dianne. So that's what came up for me, was just the issue with that.
Absolutely. Stephanie?
Yeah. It made me, let me tell you what came immediately to mind for me. And then I can talk to you about what it meant in practice, right? Before the courts. And I thought about Kaya Roll, that little 6-year-old that was handcuffed in Orlando, Florida last year. She had a temper tantrum. And she was handcuffed and put in the back of a police car by a white police officer. And that, I think, is a quintessential example of the adultification of our children. That a 6-year-old child who is having a temper tantrum, you saw this child, quote unquote, as a threat, that you felt like you needed to handcuff a 6-year-old. And all I could think about was this little girl and the levels of fear, right? All I could think about were her mother and her father. Like, that was a lot. And it made me think about the children that we represent. And each and every day when they are removed for issues that could be similar to what a white child or even a Latin child, we need to talk about that too, because there are differences, right? In terms of, there's a racial hierarchy in this country and everybody knows it, where you have white people on one end and you have Black people on the other, and then there are groups in between that slide up and down the scale, and nobody wants to talk about it, which is why I don't do this whole issue of clumping Black and brown people together, because the experiences are very, very different, and we don't even talk about and unpack white adjacency. Right? So that is, we're not even talking about white folks. We're talking about other quote unquote colored folks who are more acceptable and can identify with whiteness. And I even hate to say this, even some of our own Black brothers and sisters who may be of Caribbean descent or even from the continent of Africa we're not them, because they know in the psyche of the United States of America that Blackness is over here and it's considered the worst of the worst. And when I think about the children that we serve when they come before the courts, and I see them being removed from their families, where maybe white children or Latinx or Hispanic children get to stay with their families and services are offered, these Black people, they get high, they do all these things. No, you can't go there, but yet you can leave unattended young people who are teenagers in a house by themselves where their mother is a known substance abuser. I mean, known, living with a boyfriend and leaves them by themselves in a filthy house. That, I mean, it was the filthiest house I've ever been in my life. And they left those children there, and the social worker knew those children were there. She knew it, but she didn't remove them, but would be the first to remove the Black children. So this adultification stems back to, people don't want to hear, oh, that was so long ago. Let's go back to enslavement. Let's go back to, 3/5 of a person. Can we go there? Let's go back to dehumanization and subjugation and that you're nothing. And so, embedded in the culture, whether people say it, directly to you or not, that you're not seen to be worth anything. And let's talk about the internalization and the internalized oppression that comes with that. Yes, our children are adultified. You let a young Black girl all of a sudden be in foster care, and maybe she becomes pregnant at 13 and 14, and then they start treating her like a grown woman, although she had a baby as a young girl who was in the custody of the department. I'll let Wendy chime in.
Oh, where to start? You all have opened up so much. But one of the things that and first of all, Stephanie, I do want to just sort of give a head nod to what you said about anti-Blackness, even in Black and Brown communities. I am of Caribbean descent. I came to this country when I was 14. And it took, as Adar always says, racism and white supremacy is America's greatest export. And so even in Jamaica, I was very aware of Blackness as a construct that nobody wanted. It was very clear to me. And I came to this country when I was 14, and it took me decades to uproot that learning from me. And it's something I still find comes forward. And I think probably going into my 40s before I began to really understand the level of training I had before I even came to this country. And then of course you come here and it just gets reinforced. So I just wanted to say that because a lot of people don't know that's true. We don't talk about that a lot. But there was something in this section that really got to me. Stephanie, you were talking about, enslavement, and Janine, you were talking about our ancestors. And I got this image of how much, this idea that Mr. McKnight continues to say inappropriate things about the department. So therefore, it means that he is not a fit parent. And it really took me back to the idea that even when we were being beaten on the plantation, we were required to smile because the white people didn't like it when we cried and we were angry, we were upset. We had to smile and take it. And even here, as Jacob he's doing everything he's supposed to do. He's following the rules, but he's not smiling, and he's not making everybody feel like he's happy to be, just in touch with white people and in touch with white systems. And he is expressing his emotion. One of the things I left this with was thinking about what happens to the psyche of Black people when even as we are being beaten, we are expected to smile and act like we like it. Is it any wonder that we see the levels of mental illness in our communities that we do? If we can't express ourselves, if we can't say, I'm angry, I'm hurt, you are beating me right now. Of course I'm angry and hurt. If we can't even say that, how do we ever get our hands around the mental health crisis that is happening in our communities? Because people are being asked to suffocate themselves, suffocate their feelings. There is no way we can do that. And I will say this happens across Black communities, right? I mean, you go to work and you experience something terrible and you learn to put that smile on and keep on going. What does that do to us? I can tell you what it does to me, and I haven't been through anything like what Jacob went through. But what it does is it takes away a part of my humanity. And so I could only imagine what Jacob walked away with through this process, that he refused. And you know what? I got to say, I was like, power to you, brother. You know, you are not smiling and doing what people want you to do, but it cost him. And many of us have to make decisions on a day-to-day basis about what we're going to do in order to survive. And then we have to go home and look in the mirror and be okay with ourselves. And I've got to tell you, that is probably one of the most, you know, it's so interesting. People can do almost anything to me and I can feel hurt, but it's what I do to myself that hurts the most. It's when I have to swallow my emotions, when I have to pretend that everything is okay. I have to grin and bear it. Sometimes I dance and smile and sing. It kills us inside. And what I felt reading this was, I could only imagine what he went through. I just, you know, I can only, it's a systematic breaking down of a person's spirit. It's terrible. You're muted.
Well, mute, Julia.
Sure, you
So
said something
sorry.
really
I was
profound.
saying, I was just saying, absolutely. I think that one of the first things I think of is, you know, how a lot of the time Black people are not allowed the full range of emotion, how that starts in childhood and how that follows us into adulthood. And how, you know, when you talk about when you're looking in the mirror, looking in, you know, what we do to ourselves, how like, that's a very difficult kind of cycle to break. And it shows up at our jobs, it shows up in our personal relationships, and how you're able to move in the world without being able to say, well, this happened to me today at work and I'm angry. And so like imagining and with children particularly, you know, they are learning to kind of like, you know, regulate these emotions. When is it appropriate? And yet, you know, people will know if you're, why should someone be happy about being taken away from their family? Like, you know, like they're like why would they be smiling about that? And you know, it really brought up that quote by Zora Neale Hurston, which says, you know, if you are silent about your pain, they'll kill you and say that you enjoyed it, right? That you know, if you don't talk about it, they'll say, well, they were smiling. I mean, they obviously they liked it. It's kind of like that. Oh well, you know, slaves they could have fought back. Like they must have enjoyed slavery. Must not have been that bad. And so it's important to allow people to express themselves and to show their humanity. And sometimes like that's not going to be happiness. And so a lot of this story reminds me of the Ma'Khia Bryant story that happened, you know, a couple weeks ago. You know, she was a child of the system. And even in her death, they said, oh, she was wielding a knife. But she was a child. And she called the police because she thought they were going to protect her. And there must be a fear and almost like a knowing of being in a system that you believe is going to protect you. And at the same time, you kind of also know, like, I don't really trust this. And something's off here. And so that must also just be a very terrifying kind of thing. And how I think that kind of shows up in the work that we do. Go ahead, Janine.
I'm so sorry. No, as you say that, it also, and as Wendy, you were sharing about like what it does to like our mental wellness, and you know, I'm sorry to say this, but it almost feels like the system creates this dynamic where children are forced to yes a master in order to aid in their survival, right? Once they're in the system. And that's equally disturbing to me. And what that does to the psyche is equally disturbing.
You
So
don't
that's
apologize for saying that because that's exactly what's going on. And please finish because it was something Wendy said that I so appreciated. When you finish, I just want you to finish.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah, no, that's just what came up for me. It's like it's almost like you it's kind of like, what is it called, Stockholm syndrome or something like that, where you just kind of become conditioned to, and you placate into the abuser because you want to live, you want to be alive, and it creates this cycle, it creates the system where children just, they're lost emotionally, and we create the conditions for that. So yes.
One of the things that Wendy brought up that I think is so important is that piece about what does that do to the spirit, right? And so we are collectively, whether or not we're here in the US, whether or not we're in other parts of the diaspora or on the continent of Africa, a spiritual people. I mean, that is how we move. That is how we're centered. That is how we're grounded. And it could come in various veins, right? We all practice, could be different type of spiritual paths. And one of the things that I truly believe, why sometimes I know Black people know these things in all of these systems, whether it's in the legal system, you know, the social work system, the criminal justice system, they know these things are happening. But there is this piece about, what do I fight and what do I not fight? Because I'm exhausted. And I really just want to get home to my family and have dinner and spend time with, you know, my wife, my husband, my partner, my children. You know, that's really what I want to do. Or, you know what, I just want to come away from this encounter alive. I still want to be breathing. So sometimes there are ways where we take in these microaggressions and they chip away at our spirit and we start feeling them like in our soul and our bones, right? That is so harmful that we begin to become expressionless, right? So in this reading, and so let me just say this, I'm making the assumption at this point, and I know that the audience doesn't have the background, where Miss Lyday talked about, you know, most of the social workers that she dealt with, they were African American, they were Black. So I'm just making the assumption here that these were Black social workers that stood there expressionless. And so, you know, to see something like that and stand there expressionless, what does that say about your spirit? What does that say about your mental health, right? Or even lawyers that come in and look Black children in the face every day and don't say a word in court that advocates on their behalf with a sense of goal of justice, because a lot of that is happening too, right? I mean, what does that say? So I just really wanted to acknowledge what Wendy said about the spirit. We understand the piece about the mental health. I think people get that, but because when we talk about spirit, it's so elusive. People are like, well, what is that? You know, I don't understand what that means because it's not logical. We can't wrap our mind around that. And there has been this constant dehumanization that has broken down the spirit.
Yes, yes, thank you. Another point that you all have brought up is this kind of the discussion about whether or not they weren't speaking well about the system itself. So it's like the system itself also, it's like, you know, it's a savior complex, if you will, that I think that sometimes comes up in social work, and I'm sure in the legal system, and you know, with police officers, that they're saving, they're helping, and so you know, the system itself is kind of like really, it's on its own kind of drug. It's like, oh, well, we're helping people. This is what we do to help, and that's a really, I think, important and very scary thing, because we're looking at what help. We have to redefine what help actually is and what it could look like. So how do you think we can go about doing that, redefining what help and assistance and support actually looks like when it's not rooted in white supremacy?
Go ahead, Wendy.
I was just going to say, we started off by talking about history. And if we don't understand history, we can't root white supremacy out of these systems, right? We've got to understand that and I think Janine said this, all we are, every time white supremacy is shape-shifting and it self-perpetuates and it looks different. And if we don't understand what came before, we can't know what we're looking at. And so we saw, I hear about child welfare reform and all this. Well, we're just shifting. We're doing these little shifts, but we keep coming back to the same place. I mean, if we look at some of the policies, social policies in our systems now, they are more white supremacists than they were 20 years ago, 30 years ago, because we don't know what we're looking at. And so that's the first thing that we have to understand. We have to understand how the police system is a reincarnation of the slave overseer system. We have to understand how this child welfare system is just very much akin to this removal of Native American children from their families because adjacency to whiteness, and that means white systems. You can be placed with a Black family that's still part of a white system. So this idea of adjacency to whiteness, this is an issue I often have with some of these mentorship programs. Just bring a white person in, put that child with that child's gonna be just fine. I have all kinds of issues with that, right? We're not looking at the history. So we keep, making these shifts, and because we don't know, that we're spinning in circles, and we've got to break out of that pattern of spinning in circles. But the only way we're going to do that is to be able to see how we continue to perpetuate history over and over again by a lot of the things that seem so progressive. Yet we've been here before.
We have. And, to your question, Julia, and piggybacking on what Wendy said, when I talked about I have been pushing this federal Decouch Child Family Welfare Act, one of the things that I talked about was creating like these communal boards that would be, when these children are about to be removed, or that once they are removed within a certain period of time, we need to have experts around the table who are multidisciplinary, who are well-versed in history, right? I'm not just saying because you're dealing with Black children, you have a Black face. No, because some of us can be quite uneducated. Like people who are experts and are adept, not only in their craft, but also, right? In history and understanding what Blackness looks like in this country and the creation of Blackness politically. I think that that's very, very important to do. And, with that, like some of those things, one of the things I've been pushing in the Maryland state legislature is developing a racial justice task force that is really looking specifically around Black children who are in the foster care system, because we're disproportionately, our children are in the system and they can't seem to get a handle of it. Like we are 55% of the child welfare system, and we make up about 31% of the population of children in Maryland, and they can't get a grip around it. And like people keep pushing on FTDMs. I'm not a big fan of FTDMs because the people who are running it are sometimes very ill-equipped, right? So there are a number of things here. And I think critically, not only do we look at history, but we need to bring those together who are experts in their various fields and in history and understanding these things to really begin to look at solutions to this issue to change the system. Because the way we're doing it now, as Wendy said, we're just running in circles, chasing our tail.
Can I follow up on, I'm so sorry, Janine.
No, please go ahead.
Something what you just said about groups of particular people who understand Black culture is so critical. I want to tell you, I have a family member who was serving 3 25-year sentences because a child in the family went to school and said something in our dialect that was said. It meant something very different in English. And we could not, and so there was this whole system that swooped down, grabbed this child out of school, took her into a room without any family members. She was 4. And she was sharing language that we use in our dialect. And she was saying something that was happening between her and her brother, but it had a very different meaning in our dialect than it did in English. He's serving 3 25-year sentences. This was a young man who was in college. He was about to graduate. And as a family, sometimes we have to make decisions about who we're going to sacrifice. Isn't that terrible? Is it going to be her or is it going to be him?
It's horrible. And right there, what you said, Wendy, is why, like on these communal boards, right, or on these racial task forces, they need to have parents who have been impacted by the child welfare system. They need to have children who have aged out of the system that are old enough to have a voice on these task forces or on these communal boards. That's horrible.
Yeah, when you ask Julie about like how are we defining helping, um, people also know how to help themselves, right? Like historically, like our people were a community. We knew how to thrive together, function together, but we were stripped of our ability to function with one another. And then people swooped in to try to fix or save. And so I do believe that people have the ability to heal themselves, right? It has to be community. It can't just be objectified because people have the skill set. And so sometimes I think that um, people should just leave good and well enough alone, as my grandmother would say it sometimes, like just kind of eradicate yourselves out of the community, out of the space, right? It needs to be a space where people can begin to affirm one another. Oftentimes when we talk about racial equity, no, we need to have affinity spaces. That's not segregating. That's people declaring their affirmations in the atmosphere. But we don't want that to happen because going back to the soul issue, right? The dehumanization of the mind, if that's the making of somebody that's enslaved, that's the making of keeping someone oppressed, right? And so we need to have people that know how to heal themselves. We need to have people that can affirm one another. And it doesn't come through grant funds. It doesn't come through nonprofits. It comes from people in the community. That's what it needs to be. It's no rhyme or reason. It ain't no rhythm, no nothing to it. Just let the people heal themselves.
Julia,
thank you.
Julia, do we have time?
Yeah.
Do you have time to comment just on what Janine said? Do you need to move to the next?
No, I'm going to let you comment, and then we're going to go to the next reading. Yeah, go ahead, Stephanie.
I'm gonna go really. Thank you for saying that. Right. I think that this whole piece about self-determination is really important, and I think that this narrow shaping of who people believe we were, whether we are here in the U.S. or were enslaved in the Caribbean or Central and South America, is that we came here as this bastardized people who had nothing, where there was very intentional selection of the African countries and spaces where they took people because we had particular skills, and they wanted these skills here because they wanted us to be able to cultivate things for their wealth. And then we forget, because the people don't want to talk about this, that a number of the white European immigrants or the settler population that came here were people who were of the lower class and who were oppressed. They were oppressed. These were of the lower class. And and then we come here, people who are skilled. And you intentionally selected us because you wanted us to grow your crop, because you wanted us to make money. So that's the commodification and the dehumanization that then happened over time where we get beat down. Because why? What did Wendy say? The spirit. What did Janine say? The mind.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. We're going to have our last reading read by Regine. So I'm going to allow, hello. And you are welcome to start.
Thank you. Whew, I need to take a big breath before I read this. Thank you so much for giving me this space to read. Let me just get it up. Okay. White Reality and Colonization, page 302, 317, and 322. The psychologist reported that Jacob frequently expressed concern that what he said would be used against him, that the more information he provided, the less likely it is that he would be reunited with his children. And he expressed continued concern that the system was working against him. The psychologist diminishes and dismisses Jacob's worldview by mocking the word system, by placing it in quotations, a word Jacob used to describe his living reality. The psychologist not only mocked Jacob, he negated in his mind the possibility that such a system exists, a position he could only hold from his own privileged white worldview. By accumulating these instances that the psychologist perceives as a detachment from reality, meaning detachment from white reality, he builds his case for the pathologization of Jacob as an individual. Ray Winbush, PhD, states in his book, The Warrior Method, A Parent's Guide to Rearing Healthy Black Boys, that there is a large body of conventional wisdom in Black America about how to deal with white people in ways that will not stir white fears. For example, it is said that you always have to tell white people what they want to hear, that it's not wise to let them know you have strong opinions or are knowledgeable about anything, or you must never let white people suspect that they're not smart or in total control of the situation. Bonita may have consciously used it, Bonita may not have consciously used it, but she was certainly aware of the role of Black men in the system, the predilection to criminalize and incarcerate them. And she was able to use those paradigms to manipulate the professionals to obtain what she needed. She was rewarded for acting in a collusive, manipulative way. Jacob, on the other hand, who was forcibly stripped of his parenting role, chose to be true to his values and paid dearly for it. DSS took our children first. Then they tried to take the legitimacy of Jacob's thought. They discredited his worldview by pathologizing it. They discredited his language by assigning aggression to it. They discredited his spirituality by sneering at it. And they discredited his methods of healing by claiming superior credentials. DSS colonized our family.
Thank you so much, Rajani, for reading our last piece, but also one of it's a very intense piece. That last line always really gets me because it really gets to what we're talking about, what we've discussed here today, about the colonization of Black families, and how we are taken over and taken advantage of, and everything about us is turned on us, from our spirituality, from the way we speak to each other, everything. So, in that vein, what do we think about this last piece? How do we, what comes up for us?
Okay, I'll open this up a whole lot, but I'm stop me, Julia, stop me, just stop me. I want to talk about this piece. So let me. I want to talk about this piece that Dr. Wimbush said about what the large body of conventional wisdom is. Because the first thing that most Black people do when they come into space, whether they are conscious of it or not, is assess whether or not they're safe. That is the very first thing we do. Am I safe? And we survey the surroundings with all of our senses, right? All of our bodies, right? And when I say bodies, physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual, we are doing an assessment. Are we safe? We engage others who talk down to us often. It doesn't matter whether we're professional or not, whether we're credentialed and degreed or not, licensed or not. There is always this space that we're being spoken to as if we are children. So I could only imagine you have someone like Jacob who is expressive, who is calling what his reality is. And then, they talk about his religion, just, for the listeners, he was a practitioner in the Nation of Islam. So you have, an organization that teaches self-determination and Black pride and self-sufficiency and all of these things. So you have this Black man who comes in all of this package, and everything he's saying, the psychologist is dismissing. So think about that from the perspective of children who are young, who haven't fully developed. Their brain functioning may not be fully developed, right? Impacted by trauma because of the removal from their parents, all of that. And they come before a white psychologist who is dismissing everything that they say. What do you think they're going to do? They're not going to talk. Or they'll say, Miss Stephanie, I don't find therapy helpful. I don't want to talk to him, or I don't want to talk to her. There is an outright dismissal because they know what they're saying is not, they're not valued. And I'm gonna tell you what else they know. They know that they're not safe. And whether they know it, consciously or not, they know in every one of their bodies, they're feeling it, because people tend to think our kids don't know what's happening. They know what's happening, right? They're feeling that I'm not safe here because, and they're not using these words, I'm being assaulted, I'm being abused, because I'm being looked at as if what I say doesn't matter, because I don't matter. I truly don't matter. And they know that on many levels. I'll let others talk. I know there's so much more to say on that.
When I read this, Stephanie, you're talking about this mocking the psychologist did. And, I think sometimes we are tempted in this society to think that the experiences of Black people only these racist incidents really happen to people who are experiencing poverty or people who are not educated. But let me tell you, when my oldest son was 15 months old, I knew he was autistic. I went to every doctor, our pediatrician, everybody. We finally got a psychosocial assessment because we had to go through that in order for him to get services in school. The psychologist who did his psychosocial mocked me in the whole assessment. He put in, his mother thinks he's, quote, autistic. Because, autism is considered something that happens to smart white boys, right? Just think about that. Think about my credentials. Think about the fact that I am middle class. I am trained. I am telling you, my child is autistic. I knew at 15 months. He wasn't diagnosed till he was 10 years and 4 months. Now, fortunately for me, I was able to get him services because I was able to do that. But if I'm going to be dismissed as I'm trying to explain what I know from my training, does Jacob have a chance? I mean, he doesn't have a snowball's chance of being able to share what he knows. But the truth is that my knowledge about my child wasn't from my training. It's because I was a mother. It's because I knew my child, right? There is this expectation that we don't know our bodies, we don't know our minds, we don't know what we need. So we are both adultified and infantilized. We sort of, it's one or the other, where, it's constant. And, all I kept thinking about was Jacob, everything that he was doing flew in the face of sort of our whiteness training about who Black people are and how we show up. And he didn't have an opportunity. He would never have had an opportunity. And Jacob's story is a common story. It is a story we see in schools. It's a story we see in therapy. I mean, it is over and over and over again. And so you talk about breaking the spirit. When Stephanie says that at some point I stopped trying to get a diagnosis. It wasn't worth it to me. People said to me afterwards, oh, did you always know? Yeah, I knew. But at some point I was silenced. What was the point of continuing to go and tell people something and be mocked? You just shut up after a while and take it, whatever you can take.
Another thing that stands out when I've read this, and I agree, Julia, when she said DSS colonized our family, I literally felt like it was the purposeful erasure of her family. It was like DSS was purposefully it was perpetuating genocide against her family and a group of people, Black people. That's exactly what I took from this. And I often use that type of language because if you don't diagnose or prognose something the right way, you won't begin to treat it how it should be treated. And so I really do feel like that's what I took away from this, Julia, was that it was continual genocide against not only her family, but also against a group of people. And it also kind of felt like it was punishment to Miss Dianne for having Black kids. You know what I mean? Like, that's another thing. And it just felt very wrong. So, yeah.
You know, and to that point, and when you talked about genocide, Janine, you know, when we are truly the victims of something, we get blamed for having a victim mentality. Like, I'm so sick of that. Did it ever occur to you that we are victims? You know, and that, you know, the fact that we espouse a hurt or a pain or something is completely dismissed. It's completely dismissed. You know, Janine brought it up when Miss Lyday said DSS colonized our family. Wendy brought it up when she said she just kind of shut down, right? Like, I mean, did it ever occur to you that we actually are victims? The fact that our injuries and our pain means nothing is this consistent reinforcement about our dehumanization. And, you know, I really want to share this instance because it doesn't matter. Like, you know, Wendy brought it up. Wendy, you said this is true. You know, it is this thing where, you know, people think it's happening to impoverished Black people. It's not only impoverished Black people. I remember having a clear sparring match with a judge on the bench about something he was trying to order one of my attorneys to do. And he was bullying one of my younger attorneys, and I didn't allow him to do so. And he was attempting to bully me. And I'm going to be frank with you. I'm going to tell you what it felt like. It felt like we went back in time and that he was this plantation owner. And he looked at me as Nat Turner's sister. Oh, we got a rebellious one here. So then I became characterized as being, you know, you don't have to be so angry. And so I want to say this in the terms of being a dark-skinned Black woman and the stereotypes that are placed on us because we are assertive in our conversations and what we say. Meanwhile, he was completely overstepping, and I told him so. I said, you rule the dominion of this court. You don't rule my firm. This is my law firm. You don't tell me what to do in my law firm. And what you're doing in the law is incorrect. And I know it's incorrect because I'm one of the co-authors of the statute. And right, you know, so that was a thing, right? That was a thing. And so when you think about people who may not have, you know, the background having to navigate through all of that, this is complete genocide. But when we say it, like you said, Janine, this is genocide and it's been happening. It's never stopped. The fact that we're still living is amazing, right? That's the ancestors though, right? Let's be clear about that. But it is complete genocide and we are victims to a system. But when we espouse it, our feelings are dismissed. Why? Because we don't matter and we're dehumanized. It's all about dehumanization and subjugation.
You guys have brought up some really beautiful, just like astute points. You know, with Wendy talking about, you know, getting that diagnosis and not knowing her child, right? That I think a lot of times with white supremacy is that they don't believe that you own your own body. You don't own your own mind. So how could you know your child, right? How could you have a connection? Because that's something that's like a very maternal instinct, a very feminine instinct. And these are all things that are not ascribed to Black people, particularly to Black women. And that's a really just kind of important thing that you know that inherently, that y'all don't see me as a mother, that motherhood to me looks very different than what you all think motherhood should look like. And that's something that a lot of us sometimes learn. Another thing that was really just kind of almost funny in this passage to me was about how we as Black people and as Black families, how we teach our children to engage with white people and whiteness and white systems. That the father knew automatically that, like, in order for my children to survive, this is how you have to engage with white people. And so, you know, that is something that I think even, like, you know, in our teachings, whether, so you're doing social work or, you're being a lawyer or anything else, that stays here, right? Like that you have to engage with people in this way in order to survive. And that it kind of takes me back to what Janine was saying in the last last reading about, us helping each other, us healing ourselves. That we actually, as a community, we already have like these kind of ideas about survival. We have like, the tools to survive. We've been doing it, but like that's not looked at as, I think, crucial or right or, something that you can put in a book. Like these are just kind of like these very like, but that's not correct. This is how you're actually a family. This is what family looks like. This is what community looks like. So I think that's a very just kind of important point. And I see some people in the chat talking about, of course, like DSS perpetuating stereotypes and emasculating of men and the father. And just, I think this lack of understanding that we've seen in the last year or so with the protest, that like we have been saying and talking about these things for a very long time. Like these should not be new topics. And yet there were a lot of people, particularly white people, who were like, I didn't know it was that bad. Like I didn't know it was, so awful. And it was like you had to watch someone, be essentially like murdered in the street in order to understand what this is. And so it's no different with the child welfare system. Like, well, I didn't know they were like ripping families apart. It's like, yeah, every weekend Lifetime movie that I've seen, or like break apart Black family film that I've seen has talked about this. And so here's the thing, I don't really think that there has to be an explanation. Like we don't have to explain ourselves all the time, but how do we change within how do you change that system? Because it's such a hard kind of thing, I think, to straddle.
I don't know if you can change it. And I think that's the conversation we had in the last segment. We need to look at what things are going to be nurturing and supportive to us as a people. I think that's where the change, comes in, where there needs to be more advocacy, like some of the things that I mentioned earlier about these, community boards, having these task forces on the state level, even the national level, having that federal Child Family Welfare Act. Like there needs to be a whole different paradigm that comes up to deal with this issue, because I have looked at this thing repeatedly, and I would love to hear, what Janine and Wendy have to say. I don't know really what else to do, because people are going to want to have to understand and know this information. They're going to want to have to learn it. And I don't think that people want to learn. And I was reading this study, maybe it was, several months ago, where it was about people being mandated to take kind of these equity trainings. And it came out of the Harvard Business Review, and that people that were mandated to take it, they really resisted it. They said, in fact, they saw that it actually created more tension in the workplace as opposed to people who voluntarily wanted to engage in it. So, you're talking about people being willing and open and ready to dig deep. And when you talk about Black people, let me just say something to you. This is so clear and people don't know it. We come from a genius people. Do you know what our ancestors have overcome? Black people, in this country who were enslaved, we have a litany of literature and literary body that has been written for centuries that nobody knows anything about, because it's not part of mandatory reading, right? So I remember one of my mentors saying to me, I'm like, well, how did you know X, Y, and Z? And I was very fortunate, right? Because my parents they grew up in the Jim Crow South, we were a civil rights family. Things were really clear. So we were really clear. But you even learn more as you get older. I said, how did you know about this particular book? She said, they're not going to give it to you. You're going to have to dig for it. And so if you constantly have to do that work to dig for it, you don't know it's there. We have a whole corpus of genius literature that has been written by descendants of captive and enslaved Africans in the US. People have to access it, but we need to bring that more mainstream because the answers are in the literature and we can adopt it to today. So I'm saying that we need to have something totally different.
Yeah. Oh, you on mute, Julia?
No, I was saying if you're about to go ahead and say something, you go ahead.
Oh, okay. It brings up like the thought for me, dismantle versus disrupt. And I agree, Miss Stephanie, like I don't really know if it will change per se, but I do believe that when we affirm ourselves, we can, we can buffer, we can put on like that cloak or protective barrier. I also do think one way to disrupt it or address it really is to begin to remove the authority and power that many of the players in the system have. I think it's just too much power that exists. And I don't necessarily know if there's another entity to give the power to. I just don't believe that it should rest with the people that it's resting with per se. And I think once you remove that, I think sometimes you'll begin to see a little bit of a difference because it really is about overseership and authority. And if people don't have the legal authority to operate in the capacity that they are, then they won't be able to do it. It will become like a violation of human rights, but we're legally saying that you can violate someone's existence and rights. So
I struggle with this so much. And I'll be really transparent and say, when I start thinking about this, I must say I go to a place that is not good. I am not hopeful. I want to be really honest. I am not hopeful. I am not hopeful because white supremacy in this country is so deeply embedded. It is in the air we breathe. And since even Black people are breathing the air of white supremacy, how do we overcome this? When I go to those places, I don't know if they're good places or bad places, but where I end up with is going back to the idea. And Janine, I know your grandmother believes this, that desegregation was one of the worst things that happened for Black people.
That's what my grandmama said.
I heard you told me that before. and your grandmama is right. This idea that the only way we can survive as a people is to always be adjacent and to and under the rule of white people is going to kill us. I keep thinking about in the 60s and 70s when the Black Panthers were protecting Black communities, caring for Black people. We had a self-determination then that although we were experiencing so much racism in this society, we had our communities where we cared for each other, where we took care of each other. And a child could live in a neighborhood, and across the street there was a doctor, and down the street there was a teacher, and over here there was a lawyer, and those people were all part of the community. We took care of ourselves. But then somewhere in there, somebody told us that we would be better off if we were with white people. And I am sorry to say, but I feel like that was our undoing, because what ended up happening was that those communities we had where we cared for ourselves and cared for each other broke apart based on who had and who did not. And that's how we got to these areas of concentrated poverty, like the people who could move out of the Black neighborhood were the doctors and the lawyers, and the people who got left behind were your blue collar workers and your people who didn't make lots of money. And that is how this poverty becomes so deeply ingrained in Black communities. How now, generations after, do we go back and change that? I don't think we can. I don't think we can. One, because white people, this benefits white people the way our system is now, and it benefits a lot of Black people. I mean, there are a lot of Black people who are benefiting from this stratification of our race and culture. And the people who are less impacted on a day-to-day basis, sometimes they can choose not to. Even though they're being impacted, there are sometimes mechanisms that stop us from having to be deep in it. So when we're talking about you know, breaking open the system, can we break up the master's house using the master's tools? Or do we have to go somewhere else with a different set of tools, a different set of spiritual beliefs and practices, right? That the sorts of things that got us through those early days. How do we go back to that? Because what I feel and what I fear is that we are moving farther and farther and farther away from that kind of self-determination and self-sufficiency that we created a generation or two ago. We, despite all the struggles, we still had thriving communities. What's happening now? So not a good, probably not very optimistic. I'm sorry. I wish I could be more.
You know, it's funny that you said that, because I know that I've heard the quote of people go to their priest and their preacher for hope. But if you want people to talk about real things, you got to like listen to what's actually happening. And you bringing up that Audre Lorde quote is so important, because what's really funny about it is that that quote is never finished. The quote is actually, you know, the master's tool will never dismantle the master's house. It may allow us a temporary beat him at his game, but it will never bring genuine change. And so it's really important to remember that second half, that like you can use the tools for a while, but genuine change, radical change that we're talking about never comes from using the same tools that got us into this burning house to begin with. So I know that we have talked about a lot of stuff. It's been a very fruitful and intense conversation, and I loved every second of it. And we were going to have one of our people like share what can folks do to learn more, to bring about more change, to be a lot more active. And part of that is, of course, going to be education. So Maggie is going to actually share some things in the chat that people can kind of click on, like, you know, just some resources due to time. And we're going to also be sharing this PDF on our website and our social media, so people can read more articles, learn more about the work that people are doing, like Wendy and those are doing, to really kind of educate yourself to see where you fit in. However, I am going to open this time up for some questions from our audience today. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them. Just a reminder, like I know we are talking about Dianne's book, but we want to kind of focus and you know, on the topic at hand. So not anything about her life, but just rather like the topics that we discussed today, so like colonization, DSS, white supremacy, social work, those types of things. So if anyone has any questions, this is your time to shine. You can also put some things in the chat. I'll be looking at that. Okay, this is me.
There have been some good.
Did anyone have any? Thank you for the thought-provoking conversation. Absolutely. Did anyone else have anything else? Any questions, comments, concerns? Thank you, Becky. Thank you for your comment, Chris. Is there anything else that anyone wanted to ask, or any other points that people wanted to make? Because I know we talked about a lot of stuff.
This is Mohammed. I would like to just acknowledge one thing you said, Stephanie, about your interaction with that lawyer, with that judge, who said to you, you don't have to be that angry. As if anger is synonymous with aggression. And that's the pathologization of anger, and making anger something that's only claimed by white affluent men. So Kavanaugh can show horrid anger on the in Senate confirmation, it's okay. But you or Jacob cannot be protesting the injustices that are subjected to him and cannot speak anger. Anger is the voice of protest, the voice of objecting to the injustices of the world, but he has to shut it because since he's Black, if he's angry, he's going to aggress. Aggression is the norm of our capitalist system. And we can't even call it a system because if you call it that, it's now pointing to the aggression that is perpetuated all over the world, was done to African people and continues to every day. Pathologizing anger is actually something that's mental health people do. That psychologist is going to say, you're an angry Black man or you're an angry Black woman, you are ill. Anger becomes an illness because it's synonymous with aggression. And that makes me extremely angry. But again, I am bestowed more privilege than a Black man. So I can be allowed to be angry, but a Black man is going to get killed for showing anger and saying that I'm rageful for what's been done to me.
You are right on point. And I love how you talked about that, distinction between anger and aggression, right? Because there is a such thing as righteous and rightful anger. And people try to act like, you can't be angry, you can't be mad, even though your anger, rightful and righteous, could be about justice. But we're supposed to not feel all of the atrocities that are being inflicted upon our community. Thank you for saying that, Mr. Muhammad. Thank you.
Can I even say it goes beyond the not being angry. There is an expectation for us to be positive. There's this idea of this positivity. I can't tell you how many, so in the School of Social Work at the University of Maryland, I remember I wrote, had to write my review about what I'd experienced in the 5 years I've been working here. And I talked about some challenges we had. And one of the faculty members offered to read, she kept saying, you're just being so negative. You're just being so negative. I was like, no, I'm being real. But there's this expectation. And even recently we were working with a coach who had this whole course on how to be more positive and how not to be a victim and how not to be angry. Like, you are really teaching people that is how they have to show up in the workplace. So it's even beyond, it goes beyond neutrality, right? It's not even just don't be angry. It is don't be angry and be super positive because it makes us feel better.
Absolutely. Adar said that she had a question, so I'm going to let her ask that question.
Thank you, Julia. And thank you all, Janine and Wendy and Stephanie. You all are fire. And Julia, your moderation is, oh my God, wonderful. I'm appreciating you all so much. Wendy, thank you so much for talking about desegregation and not integration, because that often gets misframed. So I appreciate your not going there. But here's my question for the three of you. In talking about how Black communities really splintered after desegregation, can you all also talk just a little bit about how those communities, people were going to where resources were, and resources were not in those Black communities. In fact, those Black taxpayers were paying for the resources that were in white communities and never made it to their own. So can you just speak a little on that and about that stolen wealth that we still see the legacy and inheritance of today in our schools who are under-resourced and still in the ways in which Black communities are under-resourced? Thank you.
Well, I'll just start off with one thing that that came to me as you were speaking, Adar, but this is still happening, right? So this, it's the legacy and it's our current state. You know, I recently read an article, maybe it was about 2 years ago, that sort of analyzed government spending in Baltimore in different communities, right? And talked about how even today, government spending on infrastructure still is incrementally, that's not the right word, much bigger in white communities than in Black communities, but they're still using Black tax dollars that aren't being spent in those communities to maintain the infrastructure. They're using those tax dollars today in white communities and then blaming Black people for their communities falling apart. So it's true. I mean, a lot of things, you know, when we start to see this concentration of Black people in specific communities, everything left. The jobs left, the infrastructure left, the services left. And so a lot of people who could go after the services, but a lot of people couldn't. A lot of people continue to stay in communities where that have been stripped of services, stripped of infrastructure, not that they're not paying taxes for it, that they are paying taxes, but those taxes are being used elsewhere.
So Adar, I thank you for asking that question. I really welcome it because this is what we understand. I read a study that happened a while ago, and they talked about gentrification and the intentional, I mean, this is an intentional design to Black communities. And as you indicated, there were people that can afford to leave. I think about, you know, my parents are educated, right? College educated and beyond. My parents were educators coming up out of Jim Crow. I mean, they came out of Jim Crow South. They came north from Florida because they couldn't find work after they graduated from undergrad. And so shortly after desegregation, we lived in the city when my parents, you know, came here. We lived in the city. It was only like 4 years of my life. Shortly after desegregation, we moved to Baltimore County. Why did we move to Baltimore County? There were more services. And then as the community that we moved into became Blacker, right? We had a lot of white flight. And so my parents, their family grew, our family grew, right? So then we moved again to what was called, you know, more of an affluent area. It was a predominantly Jewish area. We were the only Black family in the neighborhood. And there were a lot of services there. And that's where we landed. So I think what people don't think about is when you have this displacement, what it does not only to communities, but to families specifically, right? That disruption of families, which then brings you to the attention possibly of the Department of Social Services, brings you to a place where you can't afford to move in these areas, because some of us can, but some of us can't. And so if you have these concentrated spaces of poverty where there are no services, and you're still using these tax dollars to pay for these other areas, and you're not investing in the infrastructure there, all of this becomes cyclical, right? So what kind of communities, and what do you think is what are going to happen to families in that space? They're going to see the child welfare system that's then going to take their children, that then is going to spiral out where parents are going to fall into depression, and so are the children, and then be misdiagnosed, and then overdose with psychotropic medications. The list goes on. We didn't even touch on that tonight. I mean, that's a whole topic in and of itself. The misdiagnosis, and then the subsequent prescription of psychotropic drugging that's happening to Black children in foster care, the antipsychotics that are crazy.
One thing that I will also lift up is some may say, well, when you look at Baltimore, it's an overwhelming amount of Black people and it's an overwhelming amount of resources, but it's a lack of access to that as well, right? The barriers to being even able to get to those things is also a structural problem. So, and I lift that up because some people might say, well, look at the racial demographic in the city. This isn't really the case, but there are a lot of people that can't access those different resources or benefit from certain types of programming, including like, what's it, live where you work type thing, and all the wealth that can be generated from that. So that's another thing, not only just like putting the money somewhere else, but also creating limitations on how people can access things that are happening literally in their own neighborhood. Wendy, when you mentioned the School of Social Work, anybody who's familiar with that area, you look at the university and the campus and you ride on up to Pennsylvania Avenue. It's ridiculous to look at it's like a line, an invisible line that separates two communities. So
But can I just also add, both Janine and Stephanie, you touched on this. A lot of the services provided to Black people are inappropriate. They're absolutely inappropriate, right? A lot of our services are really, so yes, Baltimore has lots of services, but a lot of those services are designed to make us resilient. That is code for living in hell and liking it. That is what a lot of our services are about. They are not about helping us figure out, you know, somebody put this in the chat, a question about sort of linking trauma and race together, right? And Janine, when Adar was reading your bio, she talked about this idea of socially engineered trauma. We're not looking at the experiences of Black people as deeply involved in a structural system that's creating pathology. We look at them as pathological. And so a lot of our services, I can't tell you how many service agencies are just perpetuating this idea that you don't have someplace to live. You don't have, what I need to do is teach you. You need to be taught how to do this. Not that there is no access to good housing. There's no access to childcare. There's no access to jobs. But it becomes about the person and not about the structure. And so yes, there are a lot of services in Baltimore, but are they the right services for Black people? I think not.
No, I would agree. It makes me think about what's standard when children are removed from their parents in court. Always asking for parenting classes. The court is always, and the parenting classes are not tailored. First of all, they're culturally incompetent, right? They are not tailored to the unique experiences and histories and understandings in the way we move as people, right? So here we have all of these services, but they are inadequate to address the needs. And everybody has to go through these cookie cutter parenting classes that may not even, and most of the time don't, address the issues that brought the children before the court to begin with. So this is where we need to really look at cultural, not only competence, but capability. Because some people are culturally incapable.
So, wow. First, I want to thank, I'm going to end it there. Because we can go all day. But I want to thank everyone for attending this event. I know it was an intense one, but I hope that you got so much out of it. I know that I certainly did. I want to thank Wendy and Stephanie and Janine. You all just brought really just amazing, awesome points, and I just learned so much. So I want to thank you all. I want to thank our readers for reading excerpts of our story. I want to thank Adar for her lovely words about Dianne and grounding our event. And I want to thank all of our BRJA folks who just really kind of helped over the last few weeks after a bunch of meetings, just kind of really helping us get this event together. It was a labor of love, and I'm just really, really proud of how it all turned out and us being able to talk about a really important subject. I'm going to ask Dan to put up our slide for our next event. If you would like to see, in June, we are doing a second part to our Black gun ownership event. And that is going to be on Sunday, June 13th from 1:30 to 3. It's called Black Gun Ownership, Rebellion, Resistance, and Survival. And lastly, for our last slide, if you would like to see more events like this, please make sure that you support us, joining our email list, going on our social media, donating if possible, and that will really, of course, sustain us to have more events like these and have wonderful panel members to come and share their amazing wisdom. And lastly, I really want to make sure that I give a shout out to Dianne, who, you know, when I first joined BRJA was, I don't even know I didn't know what I was getting myself into, to be honest. I was like, I want to learn stuff. I met Adar, but I met Dianne, and she brought so much laughter and just like wisdom. And so this event is really about her and her work, and how much I think we've all learned from her and continue to learn from her words and her story. And she definitely would have said something a little bit snarky about this, but she was amazing. And I miss her every day, and just really, really glad that we could have this event to honor her work in her life. So thank you, every single person, for coming, and I hope that you come to our next event. Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful evening.
Really appreciated it. Thank you.
Yes,
Thank you,
absolutely.
Janine. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you,
Yes.
Julia. Thank you, Dana.
Thank you,
Appreciate
Wendy.
you
This
all.
was
Great job, you all.
Thank you. Thank you all
Julia.
very much. It was great being with these amazing panelists. Julia, you were an incredible moderator. I want to thank the whole BRJA team, Dottie, Adar, Anthony. I mean, you know, Dianne, just thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Dianne was definitely in the room, and I want to thank Rhonda Lipkin. I don't know if she's in here for referring me. So to you all, this was great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.